Well, it's a beautiful day in central Iowa, and we're here today to celebrate agriculture. And of course, Ag Month was in March, but we like it so much we moved into April too, so that we could have our event this week. In all seriousness, what a wonderful crowd for a very important part of our state's economy, certainly for the central Iowa economy, for the Ames, Story County, and Boone County region that we serve as a Chamber of Commerce and an economic development organization. Agriculture is front and center to everything we do. You think about economic development in our part of the world, Iowa State is the engine. It's the economic engine that drives so much activity around our market. And what's tied directly to Iowa State? Agriculture. And so, thrilled all of you are here this morning. I see a number of new faces. Thank you for being here. Please come back and join us for other events in the future. I want to thank our sponsors, our two presenting sponsors, our platinum sponsors, AgCertain and Summit Carbon Solutions, our gold sponsor, Keen Project Solutions, our silver sponsor, Deary of Ames and Chevron REG, and our supporting sponsor, the Iowa State University Research Board. I'm going to bring two ladies up to introduce our keynote this morning, who I think you're really going to enjoy. Let me bring up Sabrina Zener and Abby Miller. Sabrina's from Summit Carbon Solutions, and Abby is from AgCertain. Ladies, come on up.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. Sabrina and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning. Bill Northey is an Iowa State University graduate who grew up on his family's farm in Dickinson County. This farm is actually still in his family today. Northey's public service began as a district commissioner for the Dickinson County Soil and Water Conservation District. His involvement with the Iowa Corn Growers Association and the National Corn Growers Association culminated in his role as president of the NCGA in 1995 and 1996. Northey was elected, that was very close and very loud. Northey was elected Secretary of Agriculture for Iowa 3 times, in 2006, 2010, and 2014. Most recently, Northey served as Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. His term ending in January of 2021, and then in April of 2022, Bill joined the Agribusiness Association of Iowa as Chief Executive Officer. We've had the opportunity to sit next to Bill for breakfast, and he's very excited to be here. We are excited to introduce him. So please, everyone give a warm round of applause for Bill Northey.
Well, good morning all. Great to be with you, and certainly thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. Certainly thank you for the creation of this event a couple of years ago, or last year, I guess. And thank you all for coming out. It's always a good time, March, April, or all the other months, to celebrate agriculture. And certainly, I would argue, especially a good place to do it now. We have an amazing agriculture in this state. Actually, I argued many times when I was Secretary of Ag in Iowa that Iowa was really almost created for agriculture. And that certainly was developed because of agriculture as well. So let me take liberty here. How many folks in this room are farmers that actually work on the farm or have a farm? Very good. Very good. I recognize some. Very good. How many work with farmers in one way or the other? Work with agriculture, agribusiness, university, processing? Look at that. Very good. Thank you. I should have said Reynolds Food Sales too. Absolutely, that's right. It is certainly something that drives the engine of the economics of Iowa. There's a lot of things within our state that we don't actually think of as agriculture. I come in from Urbandale down to downtown of Des Moines, where our office is, and and drive past Firestone there. There's 1,300 workers building tractor tires. There's another plant down in the southeast too, where Titan Tire is, and they're got nearly as many folks that are building tractor tires down there. My guess is those folks don't necessarily think they're all ag workers, but I would argue that they are. And they only exist because somebody out there is putting a wheel on a tractor or a tire on a sprayer or other kinds of things like that. One of the things that I enjoyed, I don't know that I really was aware of some of the history of agriculture coming to Iowa, and when Iowa developed, in 1850, we only had about 200,000 people in Iowa. By 1900, we had 2.2 million people. And that was when agriculture really developed. People came to Iowa for agriculture. People figured out this prairie soil was amazing. The first people that came said, I don't know if you can grow stuff in that prairie. We better go where the trees are because at least something's growing there. Then they figured out they had made a mistake. They need to go to that prairie soil that'll grow stuff, and it's absolutely amazing soil. Productive. Last year, we had a terrible drought in some parts of Iowa. We averaged 200 bushels an acre, which is an amazing feat. And people wonder why we produce corn and soybeans in this state, not some of the other things, because we do it so darn well. We really do. So, 1850, there's often little pivot points about things that happen that make things really grow. There was actually a couple lawsuits out there that went to the Supreme Court. There was one in 1857, another in 1863, about something that I'd never heard of, that there was a lawsuit on barges on the Mississippi River, or ships at that time, didn't want a railroad bridge across the Mississippi River. First of all, it's competition. Second of all, some of them were actually running into the bridge, which may say something more about the pilot than it was about the bridge. But anyway, they sued. And in 1857, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the railroads won. Actually, the lead lawyer for the railroads at that time was Abraham Lincoln. Won that case, and they said it was really, the issue was completely settled with another case in 1863. Actually, Lincoln was actually busy at that time. He was president. But that really settled the fact that you could have railroad bridges across the Mississippi River. Why did they need that? Because agriculture had so much productivity that needed to move. At that time, St. Louis was a bigger city than Chicago. And I would argue, to those two court cases, probably we ought to have, a statue or some memorial or something that recognizes those two cases in the Supreme Court. But I certainly would argue that Chicago ought to. Iowa was a big part of what built Chicago in that second half of the 1800s. And by the time you got later in those 1800s, you look at a railroad map of Iowa, and you see multiple points in every county where you could load cattle or hogs or grain, other kinds of things. They were all going east, most of them to Chicago, but other points east as well. And that not only built those areas, but built Iowa too, right? You need markets to be able to have farmers make any kind of income and have a chance to be able to invest in their farms. And that was one of the reasons we went from 200,000 people to 2.2 million people in those 50 years. Another piece, so when I was at USDA, it was mentioned that Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation. And I'll tell you, I didn't necessarily know before going into state government what the structures of these USDA organizations were, or other federal organizations. So at the USDA, you have a secretary, a deputy secretary, and 8 undersecretaries. They're each responsible for different agencies. They call them missionaries, but it's a combination of agencies. The combination for farm production and conservation was Farm Service Agencies, so farm programs. NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is conservation programs, and then crop insurance. The secretary talked about potentially being able to be a part of that, all these agencies that I and every other farmer has dealt with. It couldn't have been a sweeter spot to be able to be a part of. Certainly plenty of work to do, but something that mattered to farmers. And when I walked down my hall, I passed what's my favorite portrait at USDA. And it was actually of an Iowan, and a guy named Jim Wilson. And show of hands, how many people have heard of or know anything about Jim Wilson? A handful. That's good. I've been in crowds where not a single person has. I expect Dean Robeson to absolutely raise his hand on that. So Jim was the Dean of Agriculture at Iowa State, not for cows at that time, probably the College of Agriculture at that time, and then became USDA Secretary, and became the longest serving Secretary of Agriculture ever. Not only that, the longest serving cabinet officer ever in the history of the country. He served 16 years, 3 different presidents, from 1896 to 1912. And so you got you can imagine the rocking and rolling when Teddy Roosevelt was president. But he served that whole time, as well as McKinley before that, Taft after that. But even beyond the time, of course, no one keeps a guy around if you don't like what he's doing. So they must have liked what he was doing and the style that he had. But it said that it completely made USDA a scientific organization. It took agriculture from something that most of the folks do to more science and more engagement, and allow people to be able to go off and do other things too. As you created markets and that I would love if somebody comes across a great biography of Jim Wilson. What he did was absolutely amazing, and somebody that I'd never heard of before I became Secretary of Ag in Iowa. There's actually a little museum with some of his items up in Tama County, and that's how we got the name Jim, is he was from Tama County and came here. Another interesting piece for Iowa State folks, all of us, that while Tama Jim was on campus, Henry C. Wilson was a professor. Henry A. Wilson was a little boy learning from another famous, George Washington Carver, all on campus. And so 3 of those 4 became U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture, and the 4th one was more famous than the other 3. George Washington Carver, we still talk about him today, and just had a celebration recently for him as well. You look at time period between 1896, after that late 1800s, 1896 to 1940, 28 of those 44 years, Iowans were Secretary of Agriculture. Now, we didn't have another one until Secretary Wilson, like 2009, so what is that, 69 years later. So maybe they got tired of us. I don't know what it was. Maybe our folks decided they had better things to do. Maybe that's what it was. But there was a period, I would say, that dominated both because of the leadership of these folks, but I would argue too the reputation of Iowa. And that's also something that I got a chance to be better understand as Secretary of Ag here. When you're around other states, I had a friend that was a secretary in another state, and he's very proud of their agriculture. But he said, we had an annual meeting for that group of state secretaries of Ag here in Iowa. He said, I can't wait to come because you do agriculture. We enjoy it here. It's a piece of it. And he still makes trips here once in a while to be able to see some of the things that go on in the state. I would argue I grew up in it. I don't know that I appreciate it like I should. And I would say another place I learned to appreciate it was going on trade missions. Secretary Nagg just returned from a couple trade missions to developed countries and lesser developed countries in Asia, all good potential markets. And we go overseas. I remember going one time to an office in Japan where marketing soybeans, and we talked about Iowa. The guy asked, "Where are you from?" And he pulls out a map, and we're talking about where each of the folks on the trip are from. And he said, "Well, I've been at this and this," and he talked about the 6 trips he'd been to Iowa. I said, "Why do you come?" He said, "Because you're the heart of agriculture. I can go, and frankly, when Iowa's having trouble with production, it absolutely impacts our prices. And an awful lot of our products come from there." And I would say I would know that, in my head, but I don't know that I knew it in my heart. And the way that it felt when somebody said that across the table. That's another reason I believe is really valuable to continue to make those conversations happen, both here and over there, to be able to personalize agriculture and people in agriculture as much as we can. Trade. And we talked about it when it was between Iowa and Chicago, or Iowa and New York, by railroads. But trade now, we talk about internationally, right? It's an amazing thing. It's a challenging thing. Actually, sometimes it's even controversial in whether we should be trading with folks or not. Within agriculture, we realize we're more productive than we could possibly consider. We have 55 million layers in Iowa. I don't know if you've each eaten, you had some breakfast, but you didn't eat your 18 eggs today, right? That every Iowan, if we were to split all those eggs up that Iowa hens produce today, we'd all have to eat 18 eggs a day. So we sell them other places too. Most of those domestically. But the productivity here is sometimes almost overwhelming. Think of how trade helps. It's not that we ship pigs overseas. We do sometimes, but mostly we ship pieces that people care about. Actually, we almost always keep all of the bacon, the belly. So, we're not going to give them that. And frankly, they don't value it as much as we do. There are places in the world that actually value pig's ears more than we do. I remember delicacy in Japan is beef tongue. And here, I don't know what the market is for beef tongue. Do you have it in any shows, in any cases? Sushi. Okay, yeah, probably expensive. Yeah. But not a large market, not enough to handle all the production out there. So it's a delicacy that will actually pay a significant amount. What that actually does, by being able to sell those products that we don't want as much of, it actually lessens the price of your pork chop, your bacon, and your steak, because that producer can get a little bit more for their carcass than if we sold all those pieces here. And it feels like sometimes we're taking some of those pieces away. It must cost us more, right? No, because they get to buy the pieces that they really like for more than what we're willing to do. Then we get to keep the pieces we really want, and we're able to sell them for less because the value of that pork chop or that belly, that bacon, doesn't have to carry the whole value of the production. So that's why I'm a huge believer in trade. It's very important for us to do. It's one of the things that built agriculture in Iowa. That innovation as well, simply because we have so much production here. We have a great opportunity, great concentration of people that have ideas. And I'm biased, but I'd argue that farmers who spend all their day working hard on stuff are always trying to think of some new ways to be able to do them differently and better. And from the beginning of tractors to yield monitors here in central Iowa to genetics. Obviously, the Wallace family is so famous for the genetic. And at one time we had hundreds of companies all across the state that were producing seed. And it was somebody in some place that had a better idea. And they were creating pieces. And we've always done that. The argument still is, even if you're from another place, if you're from California, you say, well, I got this product that could help soybean farmers. Where do I go? Go to Iowa. You don't need the whole market to make a living. And we love to have it. And we love to be able to create them through a research park and innovation activity here, and certainly the connections that we have, the entrepreneurship at Iowa State feeds that as well. What a better, there is no better place than to be able to have that here, where there's producers all around that will try the new latest care techniques for making sure that sows don't lay on baby pigs, or that we have the right temperature, or that we monitor the health of every animal. And sometimes we see diseases before they're actually visible. All those kinds of things are things that can create, it has been created, and frankly, given up trying to say that things aren't going to happen, because almost always somewhere along the line somebody figures something out. Now, they need a lot of infrastructure to make that happen. We have the markets, and I think we're building that infrastructure. We had it, building it, and this is a great place to be able to do that. Another piece on innovation, I think, that we don't necessarily think of, and doesn't tell us a lot about production, but something that we really should be as proud of, and that's the conservation innovation. There's only the very first state in the country to have a state conservation cost share was Iowa. Actually, Secretary Henry Wallace was there when the national conservation cost share was established at USDA. But Iowa established back in the 70s a state conservation cost share to put conservation practices on farms, whether it's grass waterways or terraces or other kinds of things. Then about 10 years ago, actually almost exactly 10 years ago, a group of folks came together to put together a nutrient reduction strategy, saying we need innovation, we need to measure what our improvement is. You know, back in 2012, we didn't actually measure how many acres of cover crops we had in Iowa, but the guess is probably 20,000 acres or something like that. It wasn't very much. Probably a few dairy producers that were grazing it off in the spring or something. In 2021, which is the last year that we actually had Agribusiness Association do a survey as part of the nutrient reduction strategy in partnership with Iowa State to be able to look at how many acres of cover crops there are, what fertilizer rates are, whether folks are exceeding their nitrogen number or their phosphorus number, other kinds of things like that. What no-till is, conservation till is. 2021, we had nearly 3 million acres of cover crops. And actually preliminary numbers for 2022 would suggest that we're going to see a jump again in that. There's no other state that's made that kind of growth. We didn't do it by mandate. We did it by creating some cost share, encouraging folks, having a lot of field days. It's the farm groups, it's neighbors, it's having the infrastructure. That's 3 million acres out of 23 million acres in Iowa. We have 13 million acres of corn, 10 million acres of beans, 3 million acres of cover crops. That's not all of it. We've got all kinds of room to grow. But think of that. I don't know of any farmer that put all their acres into cover crops the first time. For the most part, you start small. And so if you say 12, 15% of Iowa's in cover crops, you say probably 40 to 50% of Iowa farmers have tried cover crops. When 10 years ago, we would hardly even talk about it. There wouldn't have been headlines, there wouldn't have been field days. You could have had a field day and nobody would have shown up. Now they're not perfect. They're not everywhere. And as much of a fan as I am for cover crops, I would say don't you dare mandate those. Government knows in many cases what directionally is right. We should encourage the engagement here. We should allow creativity. I got a farmer friend up in northeast Iowa that plants cover crops with his soybean planter, and plants them in 30-inch rows, and then he comes back the next year and plants in between those and lets it grow green for a while until those beans are up pretty good, and only plants maybe 25 pounds rather than 60 pounds of rye in that probably wouldn't qualify according to a state regulation. It's a wonderful system, but it's the creativity that works for him, and it wouldn't be the right thing to mandate, but it's the right thing to encourage. Not only cover crops, but saturated buffers and bioreactors, both practices that originated here in Iowa, now are national practices that are used. That nutrient reduction wetlands, again, originated in Iowa. A lot of work between the that time Department of Ag and Iowa State University on the science behind them. And you take tile line water, which can be higher in nitrogen than other surface waters out there, or water coming off the farm, off the topsoil, and you run it into a wetland, and as that is in that wetland, you'll see N2 gas come off, which is not a greenhouse gas, but you'll see about at least a 50% reduction in the amount of nitrate in the water that leaves that wetland as water that came into that. And we now are building scores of these a month or a year, whereas long ago when I was around and we were trying to get some of the permits and other kinds of things, we were building maybe a handful a year. So the opportunity to be able to scale that, bioreactors, saturated buffers, operate under the same kind of premise and nitrate reduction, edge of field practices, tile lines, and now we're doing batch and builds that are again building hundreds of these practices. I don't know that they're headline gathering for others. It's something we should be really proud of. It's something that started here, and that innovation is just really important. Let's talk scale just a little bit. One of my favorite reminders was as secretary to remind us about corn. Corn in Iowa, we think of it as big crop, 13 million acres. We had 200 bushel last year, even though we had a drought. I'm waiting for that perfect year. What's that high point? I don't know if it occurs in the next couple of years, but as a statewide average, that could be amazing. Absolutely. We produce more corn than all but 3 countries in the world. Well, in the U.S. in total, of which we're a part of, obviously. China and Brazil produce more corn than the state of Iowa. Take all the countries of the European Union together, and you take all their corn production, it's about the same size as the production in the state of Iowa. Take all the grain in Canada, wheat, barley, corn in Canada, file it up. It takes about 30 million acres in Canada. Of course, wheat production is less bushels per acre and those kinds of things, but that pile of Canadian grain is about the same size as the corn that's produced now. It's an amazing sense that I don't know as I was an Iowan, I appreciate it as much as these Japanese friends appreciate it. Others are aware of those numbers. They look to say, where is stuff getting done? And they see it, and we go, my bushel, I didn't like that hybrid last year because it was 7 bushels less than the neighboring hybrid. That's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about production here and how can we make it better. We're not necessarily thinking about the overall footprint that we have. So that piece of understanding and appreciating agriculture, y'all know I mentioned eggs. How many eggs that we have beyond what we're able to consume as Iowans. Obviously, we talk about pork production in Iowa too. It's amazing, amazing industry economically. It certainly is amazing for its production. An awful lot of the international visitors that we see have been to Iowa farms as well. Often they didn't get in with the pigs, biosecurity, but they got to Iowa farms and talked to Iowa farmers and got a sense of this production system that allowed such productivity and such a good way of being able to manage the nutrients coming out of the manure into the crops, and the crops then feeding the animals and the health of the animals. We have about 7 pigs for every person in Iowa. 22 million pigs in Iowa is our inventory at any one time. And I don't eat all my share of bacon. I eat a lot of bacon. but not that ship. That's a bunch of production that's out there. And again, get to other states and other countries, and they absolutely know about those numbers. And the way that we're able to manage those now, a whole new generation of folks looking at, can we create energy out of the manure from these facilities? Can we create better fuel product, other kinds of things? And of course, we've got fuels. We have to ethanol and biodiesel, and renewable diesel, and the opportunities there. And that was an industry when I was in corn growers back in the 80s and 90s. It was ethanol industry was a tiny industry. We didn't actually really talk about diesel at the time, but certainly something we cared a lot about. We had no idea it would become as significant as it has. That the majority of Iowa corn would actually go first into an ethanol. That's an amazing thing. That was an industry, I would argue, there are very few industries that are created within, like a corn industry, a demand that's created that can be that consequential. And it changed so many things. I remember one of the folks, it was a production guy, but it was also somebody at Iowa State who said, it used to be easy to formulate feed. How much corn, how much soybean, and some premiums. And now we got DDGs, and we got low oil DDGs and other things, and there's so many opportunities to create more efficiencies and figure out what it is and have a less expensive feed that does even more than what it does. A lot of things to test and figure out. And that was not why we built an ethanol industry. We built an ethanol industry for feed. And there is an argument now that, maybe if we're a lot of electric vehicles, some of that goes away. I would argue the opposite is true. The absolute opportunity to be able to, there's a requirement for some liquid fuels out there. Maybe you've heard Secretary Vilsack give the story hundreds of times. Probably not hundreds. It just seemed like it. Because he tells it, I think, every time I've heard it. If you don't fly in an airplane that's got a 20,000-pound battery on it, trying to make it go someplace, and you don't allow that airplane to run out of electricity flying across the ocean, you are going to have a liquid fuel. And an awful lot of other heavily powered vehicles, whether it's trucks in some cases, likely or tractors, other kinds of things, are going to be using liquid fuels. There's great reason to believe that the desire to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases is going to create tremendous demand, and that maybe there'll be a slightly smaller liquid fuel market over time, but ethanol and biodiesel are going to be bigger pieces. Certainly any ways that we can figure out how to reduce that carbon footprint of those fuels is going to be really important in value too. And so it's really important for us to think about things we were not thinking about 2 or 3 years ago, because a lot of things have changed. Let's talk just a little bit, and I'd love then to take some questions too, and let you get back to your conversation then as well. But a little bit about some of those opportunities and those changes. And I would say sustainability is one of those things a lot of us in agriculture are trying to figure out what the heck it means. And we don't know necessarily, but I would argue because of societal pressures and demand from our customers, it is something that is around, going to be around, and we over time are going to figure it out. There's an old argument that for any major changes, they take way longer than you think they're going to take, but they can be more consequential than you ever thought. Electricity comes, it's going to light some lights on a ship so you don't have to have fires. And run milking machines and everything else that is out there, and suddenly everything, including our phones and everything else, that electricity is pretty darn important. Computers come around, we'll just crunch some numbers so the government has big computers and can get the tax returns at least to you within a year or something. Now it's monitoring systems, all kinds of other things. I don't think that they envision yield monitors
when they talked about GPS. They were talking about making sure planes got to the right place. And people knew where they were at there. And I would argue sustainability could be some of the same thing. It's not going to happen tomorrow. We're not going to get it all defined by tomorrow. We're not going to have standards. But this is something that's coming. I think it'll impact a lot of what we do, our kids do, our grandkids do over time, because this doesn't matter. But I also don't think the train has left the station and that somebody could tell you exactly what it's all going to look like either. But I would say ignore it at your peril. Still, make sure you're raising a crop, make sure you're making money, pay the bank, do the kinds of things that make sure that you're still in business, but also pay attention to these other pieces. There is a farm bill that's up soon. That's some of those things that matter out there. I got a chance to be in USDA when we did the 2018 farm bill implementation piece. Let's say government works when you participate. So take every opportunity to be able to talk to folks that are in government. I was one of those that needed a lot of input. Many of you were very helpful to me in understanding what we could do in state government or federal government to be able to be better. And that is needed, and 99% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, people want that conversation. They actually, 100% of the time, they need that conversation. They need to be able to know. We had to create a couple payment programs for COVID relief or for trade relief. We had no idea. There was no blueprint to go off of. And we needed a lot of help by a lot of folks to figure out how to pay apple growers, which happens to be led by NIWA, the National Association, or nursery and landscape folks. That actually wasn't NIWA. It was Tom Hughes at the time, who was president of that organization too. Or pistachio makers. That wasn't NIWA. And we had to figure out who was getting losses, what was impacting their trade, what was impacting their COVID demand, those kinds of things. And it took those engagements to be able to not get it right, but get closer and avoid some of the mistakes. Let me finish with this legacy in Iowa. My favorite day as Secretary of Agriculture was always at the State Fair, giving out Century Family Farm Awards and Heritage Family Farm Awards. And we had, I think, three, actually, there were 232 Century Family Farm Awards this last year, 119 Heritage Family. That means a farm has been in the family for 100 years for Century Farm, and 119 of them was 150 years in the same family. Actually, we in our family don't, in the farms that we have in Spirit Lake, Dickinson County area, don't have any Century Farm Awards. We can see them from here. We're close. But we're not there yet. Certainly no Heritage Farm, although I have one on the other side of my family that goes back to the 1860s. And so it is heritage. But these families have come across that stage, and often it is a large number of members of that family. We had families that were 40 or 50 people that came across the stage, often dressed in the same T-shirt. I actually heard a story the other day. One of the folks laughed and said, "We spent more on our T-shirts than great-great-grandpa did buying the farm." It was cheaper back then, but I'm sure that felt pretty expensive when great-great-grandpa bought the farm. But they're so, and rightfully so. Every single one of them has a story of how they almost lost the farm. It was the 30s, it was the 70s, it was 3 years of drought. There are tears. We had a guy that came across, and he was in a wheelchair, and said, "How you doing? What's going on?" He said, "I had brain surgery last week. Doctor said I shouldn't come," and I said, "I'm going." Obviously, they're all bawling. And it is a day that starts at 9 o'clock in the morning, goes till 6 o'clock at night. Your hand actually can get tired of shaking hands for that long. My hand is sore at the end of that. Your feet are definitely But you're excited for that last family and the pride that they have. I would argue, as great as our production is, what it does for the culture of Iowa and the pride, and I would argue humility, because we've all made mistakes and we get a chance on the farm to have our mistakes pretty obvious, not only to us, but sometimes to our neighbors. When the herbicide doesn't work, or yield, what spot was supposed to be drained and it's not, and other kinds of things. It's a great thing for the culture of Iowa. It's a great thing to build in economics, but it's a great thing for a culture. And so we're very blessed to be from Iowa. We're agriculture special, and it's also very appreciated that you celebrate here agriculture, that we're able to take a few minutes to be able to do that. Of course, we should think about it every time we pick up a fork. We don't. We're thinking of other things sometimes, but certainly I have great appreciation and thank all of you that are involved. So, let's take a few minutes. If folks have questions, I would love to try to work, or disagreements with any of that things and arguments. I'll take. Yes, please.
What is a troubling agricultural issue for you?
So, short term, one of those things is we see such changes in prices. It's a great thing when prices go up. It's a tough thing when prices go down. And sometimes the grain prices or the livestock prices go up, and the costs go up, and the prices then go back down. So we see this gyration. Managing that risk is a real challenge. The other thing that I would argue right now, we're seeing so many wonderful technology opportunities. It's hard to choose. It's hard to figure out which of those are the right thing. We get probably 15 new biologicals. What are biologicals? They're things that are typically naturally occurring out there. Somebody figure out how to isolate it, grow a bunch of it, and maybe it will make our plant use nitrogen more efficiently, or actually produce nitrogen. And does it do it in all years, or only years that there's enough moisture, or when the temperature is right? How do we choose between those 15 or 25 new biologicals? There's a whole interest right now in drones. We just had a committee meeting the other day, and folks said almost everybody I know has gotten a drone. And we have retailers, ag retailers are our main membership part here, which are folks that are selling agronomy services to farmers, that are buying grain from farmers. Many of them have invested in drones. Many of their farmers have invested in drones. You can spray products with it. You can scout fields. You can seed cover crops. I've got a friend who his son bought a drone, or maybe a couple drones this last fall, and they seeded all their acres to cover crops with those drones. Now, figuring out, should you be buying a drone? Should you be buying a planter? These kinds of tools. All of it costs money. All of it is still yet to be proven on your farm. And how do you manage all those in a way that still you have enough at the bottom line that you're able to do the stuff that you know how to do? So that's a good opportunity and challenge, but it is a challenge too. As well as the concern about what sustainability may mean. Does that mean I have to change my practice? Does that still make me competitive against the corn farmer in Mississippi or North Dakota? Or how do those all sort out over time? I'd still argue we're in the sweet spot here. It's probably very likely to work for us. I'd be more worried if I was in Mississippi or North Dakota on those issues because we're so efficient here. Thank you.
Bill, what's the situation in Ukraine with the war? How does that impact the Iowa farm?
So, question on Ukraine and the impact, and there's several different pieces. One is, resources-wise, Ukraine is like an Iowa of Eastern Europe. It is an amazingly productive area, except that it's not had a great infrastructure. It doesn't have a great ag business. It doesn't have great government support. You didn't always know whether a contract was there. You had tough infrastructure, but it's still was an amazingly productive area that is going to produce a lot less right now. Within that region too, because of that battle, we've lost some folks that were supplying fertilizer as well. So we saw fertilizer prices increases because of Belarus and Russian sanctions that we have, as well as other things going on. You never figure out. There's never one reason for anything. There's multiple things that are happening. We have a lot of Iowans that are trying to help over there, that are trying to help producers get their feet back under them. There's some seed donations, other things. I would argue that at least some of the stories that I've heard coming out of that area, that they're creative folks trying to figure out how to farm around shell holes where bombs have blown up soil and where they don't know whether they're still going to own that or be able to be on that land by harvest time, with prices that their grain prices have dropped because of the cost of transportation, but their fuel prices have increased because of the cost of transportation. It's really tough, and it's going to be likely a very long-term impact. The argument could be then, and it did, it shortened some of the supply and some of the crops out there, corn, they're a big corn producer, and wheat and some of the other products, and so that shortened supply, so we saw some price impact because of that. But we have this way of finding other ways to fill holes, and so just because they continue to be short doesn't mean we'll continue to have good prices for some of those. There is a, as I talk about some of the folks that have gone over and talked also about trade, I remember a stat that I never confirmed, and if I'm wrong, I don't want to know about it actually, that Iowans have more passports per person, per capita, than any other state. Now, exactly, we don't have an international border. Why would that be? I'd argue because of agriculture. And because we're tough to sell, I would argue you can go to any small town in this state and you'll find a church that has a missions organization that's reaching out and helping somebody. We have a state that could be very inward focused. We have many folks that have very much of an outward focus. So I think we'll see some folks that we'll be able to brag on in the future that have helped rebuild some pieces of Ukraine. It's had an impact on our agriculture here. It's hard to isolate what that is. Good economists can tell you what that is, not me. But it's a good question. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Bill, this past year exposed us to concern on logistics with the river lines in row, the concern for barge traffic. How do you think about two things? One, how do we make a more vibrant logistics system? Or two, add to the processing of products here in the Midwest?
First of all, we're way better off on our own domestic processing because of ethanol and certainly the soybean crush that's here and potential increases there as well than we used to be. So that's good. We have a great livestock industry as well that we actually, in some cases, can almost use up all our corn here. We don't use up all our soybeans, but certainly some of those corn products need to use that transportation then too. So I do think that when we see those things, it reminds those that are investing in those that they need some investment. There needs to be some investments on that river. I don't know whether that'll happen because that's really government driven and it's been a challenge to do. Can you believe we had one of our lowest river levels ever this last December, and now there's conversations about flooding on the Mississippi River. How does that work? After a winter, why? How could that possibly be? Well, that wasn't a long-term fix, but it may be a short-term fix. But I would argue there is a greater appreciation for infrastructure issues, whether it's ports, rivers, railroads. I don't know how we increase that investment other than give market signals that it's worth it for folks to be able to do. You had some barge rates that were really high. You know, can we figure out ways to other people to invest in more barges and other kinds of things? It probably doesn't affect water level or dredging that needs to be done or other things. But that was part of the reason an ethanol industry was created long ago. And some of the livestock production, he went and searched out. One of the reasons we have more than our average footprint should be for ethanol production is it went to where the lowest price corn was. Because we had more and it had to be shipped someplace. And now in some cases we're at the lowest price corn anymore because we have that much demand. So better than we used to be. We sure felt it, and certainly along the Mississippi River felt those low bids this last year. Yeah, thank you all for taking time and being here. Dan and your team, thank you for recognizing and being engaged in agriculture every day. But certainly bringing the group together as well. And I say thank you to all of you. Your support, certainly as a Secretary of Ag, I had to run for office, and some of you were very supportive of that. I had to try and do the right kinds of things when I was there, and many of you helped me with that and being able to learn. So I'm so glad to be back in Iowa. And I'm at Agribusiness Association. I look forward to being in touch with many of you regarding the business side and how we can partner with producers and do a better job of representing ag businesses as well. So thank you all for your time this morning.
Well, Bill, it's clear to me that the Agribusiness Association of Iowa is in good hands. Thank you for your presentation. I love your message about how agriculture has created the culture that we enjoy here in Iowa. I couldn't agree more with you. So before you leave, though, this should be an Easter basket, really, shouldn't it? I've got a box of goodies here for you from the Ames Chamber of Commerce with a variety of products that have been made here or are produced here in Ames, Story, and Boone County. We've got I'm not going to rattle off all things that are here, but there's a lot of cool stuff. So if you ever get a chance to speak at one of our events, this is what you get. Bill, thanks so much for being here today.